The war in Gaza is obviously a huge focus of global attention, but it's also being seen through a lot of different religious and theological lenses. So today, we're going to dig into one of those perspectives, a sermon that frames this entire conflict as a physical sign of a spiritual war that's described in Scripture. Okay, let's get into it.
So the sermon kicks things off with these huge questions, but instead of giving a geopolitical answer, it offers a prophetic one. And it does that by drawing on this really complex web of scriptural allegory. We're going to explore exactly how the sermon uses these allegories to build its case.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the sermon's big question about the identity of Israel. Then we'll unpack the key symbolic figures it introduces. You've got the woman, the dragon, and the child. We'll see how those symbols are applied directly to the war in Gaza, and then finally, what the sermon tells its listeners to actually do about it.
Okay, to really get what this interpretation is all about, we've got to start with the core distinction it makes, and that starts with the Apostle Paul's writings in the book of Romans.
You see, the sermon pulls this quote to set up a really important idea, that there's an Israel after the flesh. This is all about the physical bloodline, the direct descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the first piece of the puzzle.
And this is where the core argument really starts to come into focus. The sermon makes this very sharp distinction between that physical bloodline and what it calls the true Israel. Now, this true Israel isn't defined by who your ancestors are, but by faith in the Messiah. The key point, according to this view, is that not everyone from the physical family tree is automatically part of this spiritual group.
Okay, so now that we have that distinction in our heads, the sermon brings in its first big symbolic character, the woman. Let's take a look at who she's supposed to represent.
So, this woman in scarlet, what's that all about? Well, in the sermon, she's the symbol for the covenant people of Israel. And the color, scarlet, is really intentional. It's meant to show a people who are marked by both deep sin and a deep divine promise. She's the one carrying the bloodline of the Messiah, but at the same time, she's imperfect, even rebellious.
And this isn't just pulled out of thin air. To really ground this symbol, the sermon goes right to the prophet Isaiah. This verse is used to connect that color scarlet with sin, but also to hold out the hope of redemption. So it creates this dual identity, a people seen as sinful, yet at the same time loved and promised a future restoration.
Okay, so every story needs a good guy and a bad guy, right? If the woman is the, let's say, flawed hero, then the story needs an antagonist. And for that, the sermon points to a counterfeit figure, one that works in direct opposition to her.
Now, this idea is absolutely central to how the sermon sees this whole conflict. It argues that there's a counterfeit Israel out there. This is a group that claims the name, but, in this interpretation, is spiritually lined up with a being called the dragon, who's identified as Satan.
And just like before, the sermon points right back to Scripture to back this up, specifically to this verse from the book of Revelation. This text is used to make the case for a deceptive group that looks like one thing on the outside but is spiritually something else entirely.
All right, so we've got our players on the board, the woman and the dragon. Now things get really interesting, because we're going to see how the sermon connects this spiritual drama directly to what's happening on the ground in Gaza.
To do that, the sermon zooms in on the exact location by pulling out this prophecy from the book of Amos. By quoting a verse that literally names Gaza, it tries to create this direct bridge between an ancient prophecy and what we see in the news today.
And there it is. That's the main idea in a nutshell. The fighting, the destruction, all the politics. In this view, it's all just a physical shadow of a much bigger, invisible spiritual war between the woman and the dragon. The battle on earth is just a reflection of the one in the heavens.
But you know, this whole cosmic battle isn't just left hanging. The sermon introduces a third character, who's basically the game changer, the one who is described as the ultimate victor.
And that figure is the male child. He's identified as the Messiah, and according to this reading of prophecy, he's the one destined to rule everything. He's the one who ultimately takes the fight to the dragon in the heavens and wins.
You could say this passage from Revelation 12 is really the climax of the whole sermon story. It's presented as the definitive prophecy of the woman giving birth to this ruling child, and then the huge battle in heaven where the dragon is totally defeated and thrown out. This is the guaranteed end of the spiritual war.
So, after all that, what's the takeaway? What's the point? The sermon doesn't just leave you with an interpretation, it gives a pretty clear call to action for the people listening. Let's have a look at what that is.
It really boils down to these 4 practical steps. First, it urges listeners to figure out who the true Israel is based on their faith, not their family tree. Second, to be on guard against the counterfeit.
Third, to take a stand with the woman, the persecuted but faithful group. And finally, to keep their eyes fixed on the child, because he's the source of all hope and the ultimate winner.
And it all wraps up with this final thought, this final charge, you could say. The sermon ends by stressing that winning this spiritual fight isn't about physical power. It's about faith in the Messiah, who's called the Lamb here, and about having the courage to speak the truth.
So there you have it. We've just walked through a pretty specific and, pretty complex theological lens for looking at a modern conflict. It completely reframes the war. It's no longer just a political event, but a prophetic one. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. How does seeing any geopolitical event through a spiritual lens like this one ultimately change how you see the world?